All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a true crime-style historical investigation to uncover the actual truth behind one of literature's most infamous villains. I mean, we all know the story, right? Shakespeare's tyrannical, bloodthirsty Macbeth, the guy driven completely mad by his own dark ambition. But what if the man we think we know is literally a total fabrication? We're going to dig into the historical records, stack them up against the legendary play, and unearth this incredibly fascinating story of political spin that honestly changed history forever.
So, I want you to start by asking yourself this one simple question. What if one of literature's most notorious tyrants was actually a successful, generous king? Seriously, prepare to have your preconceived notions about Shakespeare's quote-unquote dead butcher completely shattered. Because the guy written about in the actual history books, he is wildly different from the man we see up on stage.
Okay, let's start with the real history. Meet Macbeth mac Findláech, the 11th century king of Alba, which is modern-day Scotland. He was actually nicknamed the Red King. And, unlike that paranoid, universally hated usurper from the play, surviving historical texts paint a totally different picture. There's a near-contemporary verse history that actually calls him Macbeth the Renowned. Another one literally calls him the pleasant and generous king of Fortru, noting that Scotland was absolutely brimful of prosperity, west and east, during his entire reign.
Okay, let's dive right into this timeline, because tracing his actual footprint is super revealing. His rise to power happens in 1040, when he defeats King Duncan. But notice this, Macbeth then rules for 17 mostly peaceful years. 17! He was so secure in his position that in 1050 he safely left his kingdom to make a religious pilgrimage all the way to Rome. Historical accounts say he gave money to the poor there as if he were literally scattering seed. Finally, his reign only wraps up in 1057 when he's killed in battle at Lumphanan by the forces of the future Malcolm III.
And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering contrast between history and literature. The historical King Duncan? Yeah, he was not the elderly, perfectly peaceful grandfather figure Shakespeare created. Actually, scratch that. The real Duncan was a young, highly aggressive guy whose early reign was marked by disastrous military campaigns. When he marched into Macbeth's domain of Moray on a punitive expedition in 1040, he wasn't murdered in his sleep by a treacherous host. No, he was killed in action right on the battlefield at Bothnagowan.
So, how on earth do we get from a generous, secure, 17-year ruler to the ultimate literary villain? Well, we have to pivot to Shakespeare's fictionalized Jacobean tragedy. Let's look at how the historical facts were just completely rewritten for the stage to create a story of absolute horror.
Shakespeare essentially condenses decades of history into a fast-paced, terrifying 5-act plot. It kicks off with the Weird Sisters, the witches, offering supernatural prophecies that spark Macbeth's ambition. Then, instead of a battlefield victory, Macbeth commits the ultimate betrayal. He murders a sleeping King Duncan in his own home. From there, the paranoia just spirals. Macbeth assassinates his friend Banquo, whose bloody ghost then crashes a royal banquet. The cruelty hits its absolute peak when Macbeth slaughters the innocent wife and children of Macduff, and finally, the tyrant is besieged by Malcolm's army, who brilliantly use the branches of Birnam wood for camouflage to fulfill the witch's final prophecy.
So the crucial point here is the psychological weight of it all, which is perfectly captured when Macbeth confesses, "I am in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go over." Shakespeare is showing us the crushing psychological weight of the fictional Macbeth's actions. He realizes he's crossed a line of no return. It's this terrifying portrayal of an addiction to violence. The character becomes totally trapped in a bloody cycle of his own making, which is just so far removed from the historical king who safely traveled to Rome and back.
But to really understand why Shakespeare altered the history so drastically, we have to look at the literary and cultural analysis of the play. Because this wasn't just a story about a bad king. It was an exploration of the absolute spiritual devastation caused by the act of regicide, the killing of a king.
You see, the play was written against the backdrop of two major Jacobean doctrines, the divine right of kings and the great chain of being. According to these concepts, the monarch is appointed directly by God and sits at the very top of the natural human order. Therefore, when Shakespeare's Macbeth murders Duncan, it isn't just a political crime, it is a literal sacrilege against God. It completely unravels the natural order of the universe, plunging the entire world into darkness and chaos.
And we see the immediate psychological punishment for this cosmic crime right after the murder. Macbeth hears a voice cry out, "Macbeth does murder sleep, the innocent sleep." Notice how this famous quote beautifully personifies sleep as innocent. Shakespeare is essentially contrasting the peaceful, guilt-free conscience of a legitimate, rightful king with the tortured, completely chaotic mind of a usurper who has stolen the crown. Macbeth has destroyed not just a man, but the peaceful, restorative nature of the kingdom itself.
Let's move on and see how this builds across the play. We have to look at the characters Shakespeare deliberately uses as foils to highlight exactly what Macbeth is destroying. He uses Duncan, Banquo, and Macduff to brilliantly illuminate the specific qualities Macbeth lacks or just throws away entirely.
We can map this dynamic out perfectly with this table through three specific men. First up, we have Duncan, who represents the natural order and the holiness of the crown. Macbeth's failure here is his injection of chaos and sacrilege. Next is Banquo. Now both men receive prophecies from the witches, but Banquo represents moral fortitude. He remains skeptical and refuses to let ambition corrupt him, which contrasts sharply with Macbeth, who immediately yields to temptation. Finally, there's Macduff, who represents righteous action. While Macbeth falls into desensitized tyranny, Macduff feels the true weight of his actions and fights to restore justice to Scotland.
This contrast is incredibly powerful when we look at how the play defines masculinity. Macbeth, who is heavily influenced by Lady Macbeth, comes to believe that true manhood is defined by cruelty, violence, and a complete lack of fear. She challenges him to be so much more the man by committing murder. Macduff, on the flip side, offers a completely different definition. When he learns that Macbeth has slaughtered his entire family, he's told to dispute it like a man, but Macduff replies that he must also feel it as a man. Shakespeare is showing us that true strength requires empathy and grief, qualities that Macbeth completely throws away. And this brings us to the literary climax of the play, a moment of peripeteia, or a sudden reversal of fortune. So Macbeth has been fighting with this arrogant confidence, relying on the witch's prophecy that no man of woman born can harm him. But out on the battlefield, Macduff reveals that he was from his mother's womb untimely ripped, referring to a cesarean birth. In this brilliant moment, the prophecy is totally shattered. It proves that Macbeth's unnatural kingship can only be defeated by an unnatural birth, acting as an agent of divine justice to restore the throne to its rightful heir, Malcolm.
So the play is an undeniable literary masterpiece, for sure. But it brings us right back to our original investigation. Why take a relatively stable, generous 11th century king and turn him into this ultimate symbol of tyranny and spiritual ruin? To answer that, we really have to bridge our literary analysis back to historical politics.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the true function of this fictionalized history becomes super obvious when we look at the political landscape of the time. Shakespeare wrote this play shortly after King James I took the throne, and James claimed to trace his ancestry directly back to a historical figure named Banquo. So, by writing Banquo as a pure, noble man who resists the witch's dark temptations, Shakespeare was directly flattering his new king. Plus, by portraying the absolute nightmare that engulfs Scotland after Duncan's murder, the play heavily validates the divine right of kings, offering a very stark, very public warning against the chaos of treason.
By the end of the tragedy, Shakespeare strips his fictional Macbeth of literally everything: his sleep, his sanity, his wife, and his kingdom. Macbeth famously concludes that his life has become a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. This famous metaphor portrays the devastating realization that turning against the natural order and seizing power without divine legitimacy leaves you with absolute nihilistic emptiness. It was a hugely powerful message for a Jacobean audience.
Which leaves us with this final, profound question to consider. Why is a 17-year, largely peaceful reign completely eclipsed by a playwright's political fiction? The real Macbeth gave to the poor in Rome and ruled securely for almost 2 decades. Yet to this day, his name is basically synonymous with bloody ambition and tyranny. It is an incredibly provocative reminder of how the power of literature, combined with a little political flattery, can completely and permanently assassinate a historical legacy. The Red King of Alba is lost to history, replaced forever by the ghost of a dead butcher. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it leaves you questioning the history behind the stories we think we know.